This session is being recorded. And again, please, if you are, I thought that I was able to mute everyone, but oh, you mute all.
You've now muted the.
But
Mark.
I presented, so I've muted also Mark, apparently. I don't know how to unmute him. Mark, can you unmute yourself?
His name.
It doesn't. That's the problem. Okay, so.
There we go. I had to stop sharing though, so now I got to reshare.
Oh, okay. Okay, so welcome to everyone for the first session of the colloquium this year. This year will be a little bit different with the fact that we didn't know what will have been the status of what we would have been doing. We finished to have only internal speakers, also because several of the external speakers of last semester that we were trying to move on this semester and doing them as in a virtual session, they turned down. So we decided that for this semester we have all internal speakers. Mark is offered to be the guinea pig, so we will see how today is working. So welcome to everyone. The format will be different depending on the speakers. Mark has decided to do it completely synchronous. In general, we will have a synchronous session where there will be the talk. Some of the talk, like the one of Bogdan, will be a pre-recorded talk, and Bogdan will be in the room anyway to answer for questions. But yeah, so essentially will be a mix of a pre-recorded talk and a completely live talk. And yeah, we'll see where it's going. I see that there is 50 people, is a number we rarely reach, and I don't think we would have enough seat in the room where we do the talk. Mark is, yeah, you're not, you're on a preview version, not in the slides.
Oh, am I not? Okay, hold on.
We see your next slides.
Okay, hold on. How about now?
Not yet.
Oh, I know why. Hold on. Hold on. All right, technology. Let's see, back in here. Sure. I think it's this one. How about now?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, right. So at this point, I leave everything to Mark. Please, if you mute yourself if you're not presenting, and if you have question, type the question in or say something in the chat, and I can give you the to speak later. We try to have questions only at the end of the talk and not during the talk, because otherwise will be a mess. Okay, with that, thanks Mark to be our guinea pig, and I let you start your talk.
All right, thanks Rocco, and thanks for letting me kick this off and work the kinks out. So I'm going to talk for between 30 and 40 minutes, but I'm kind of going to give two related talks. The first half will be about science, and the second half is going to be about outcomes, by which I mean sort of changing behaviors on the ground and making for better outcomes for this community. So the whole talk, or both halves, are really built around the four-letter word that starts with F in Alaska, which is fish, and specifically anadromous fish. So anadromous fish, like salmonids, spend most of their adult life in the ocean, but they return to the freshwater environments to spawn. And in the case of most salmonids, they also overwinter for 1 year before they outmigrate as 1-year-olds. So they're really critical parts of the aquatic ecosystems. They're important parts of the terrestrial ecosystem, serving as food for things like bears and so on and so forth. Really important parts of a really critically important sport fishing and commercial fishing economy. And probably most importantly, Alaska, is that it's central to their culture. And I don't just mean the native culture. I mean, all Alaskans have subsistence rights. And there are times and places of the year where they can go literally with giant nets like this guy has and dip salmon right out of the ocean or right out of the rivers. And they bring them home and stock their freezers full of salmon for the year. So it's unlike sort of any resource in any other place I've ever lived or even visited. It really is a central part of who they are in Alaska. So we started working, this is back maybe 2006, I said a decade plus, but that's quite a bit of plus, working on the lower Kenai Peninsula, sort of south central Alaska, off the Cook Inlet, and a really highly productive salmon fishery there. And when we started working down there, I mean, everybody knows the salmon go out to the ocean, they come back into these rivers to spawn, and it's really obvious where they spawn. But we didn't really know much about where the juveniles overwintered. That was largely a mystery. So the very first thing our team did was just do some electrofishing to figure out where the juvenile salmon are actually rearing and overwintering. And what we were able to do was massively expand what they call the anadromous fish catalog. Every dot on this map, and that's the entirety, it's about 800 square miles there, the entirety of the Kenai Peninsula lowlands. Every dot's a place that fish were caught. And then the lines are the stream connections. And some of these streams are dinky. I'm like 10 centimeters wide and a couple centimeters in depth, and you might find abundant juvenile salmon that are rearing there. But as we did it, it was really interesting. We were walking around this landscape, and it's the leakiest dang landscape I've ever been in. Like, you literally can't stand in a river and throw a pencil without it landing in a seep or a spring. I mean, everywhere water is pouring forth from the ground and feeding into the rivers. And so we started talking amongst ourselves and thinking about how sort of the landscape supported salmon. It wasn't just the streams themselves, it was the entirety of the landscape. So here's a cartoon of a headwater watershed with a dinky stream running down the middle. And there might be groundwater flows and groundwater discharge to the surface. And there might be interactions with alder patches. Alder are like a shrub or small tree, and they have symbiotic relationships with bacteria in their roots. Those bacteria are able to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere, mineralize it, and make it available to the plants, and thereafter it's available to the terrestrial environment. And now this groundwater, which we assumed would be enriched in nitrogen, might flow down gradient and interact with riparian wetlands along the sides of these small streams, and all that might then feed into the stream itself and create salmonid support. So that was sort of the big idea, the big framework and sets of hypotheses that we began chasing. So let me take these things a little bit at a time. There's a ton of information here that you don't need, actually, but it filled up the slide. Well, all I really want you to look at is over here, because the first thing we were interested in was how much water in the stream started its journey underground, right? So we take geochemical measurements, we use mass balance mixing models, and we arrive at these two columns over here. The left-hand column is spring. This would be like May during what's called breakup, when the whole world is melting up there. And then summer would be late July is sort of the peak of summer, and it hasn't started raining or snowing yet. So that's maybe May and July there. On the left, you see about 40% of flow, even during breakup, started as groundwater, about 60% in late summer. So let's just say half the flow in the summertime started its journey underground. Presumably in the middle of winter, when it's frozen over, if there's any flow, it's 100%. And we have evidence of that too, because groundwater takes on the temperature, the volumetrically weighted average temperature during recharge. So snow and ice don't recharge. So the volumetrically weighted average of recharge has to be above zero, All right, so what you see here, there's Jason Bellino. Many of you may remember him. In the foreground is one of these streams, and he's standing next to a well he's just installed. And we've got dozens of these where we have temperature sensors in the stream and in these adjacent wells, and we get plots just like the one you see here. Temperature on the y-axis and date on the x-axis. That's an entire year, and it starts in summer on the left, goes through winter in the center, and goes back into the following summer on the right. And there's 3 lines there. There's a gray line that is surface water temperature in that dinky little stream. The black line is the groundwater temperature, and the black dashed line is the air temperature. So taking them in reverse order, the air temperature does what you'd expect it to do, right? It's kind of really cold in the wintertime, down towards minus 20 degrees Celsius, pretty warm in the summer, upwards towards 10 or 15 degrees Celsius. But look at the surface water and groundwater. They're real coincident. I mean, they're hardly different from one another, even in the depth of winter, right? And the key is this, that's 0, right? So this groundwater discharge to that dinky little stream is sufficient to keep it liquid throughout the middle of this long, prolonged, and deep winter. So what this means, oh wait, hold on before I go there. So, but this is a local effect, right? I mean, as soon as groundwater comes out of the ground in the background, it ceases to be groundwater, right? And in the foreground, it's surface water, right? So the effect is real, and you can see it here in this plot. This is model results. It's sort of basically an energy balance, and the y-axis again is temperature. The x-axis now is distance, and we've segmented this stream into 250-meter segments. And we do an energy balance on each segment. And there's 2 runs here. So the run that's represented by the closed black circles is a run where we allow groundwater discharge to every segment, right? And the one that has the open squares, we allow groundwater discharge in the first segment, but never thereafter. And what we see is that there's an immediate deviation. Once the groundwater discharge shuts off, in this case, in this run, temperature rises from 8.5 degrees Celsius to about 12.5 degrees Celsius over the span of a few thousand meters. Now, obviously, there's all kinds of things that go into this. You know, it's what's the aspect, what's the shading, what's the air temperature, is it summer or winter? But no matter what, whatever you do, you get the same sort of phenomenon, that over some distance, delta D, you get a deviation of temperature, delta T. Point being, it's a local effect. And you'll see that here in a moment, because this is the consequence, right? So here's 2 places. The one on the left is summer, the one on the right is winter. We'll take the summer one first. Flow is from left to right, and that water coming in is 14 degrees Celsius. It's getting upwards towards the 20 degrees Celsius. That's a little bit hard on juvenile salmonids, but that spring is discharging there, and it's 6 degrees Celsius right where that water crashes in. So thermal refugia in the summer, providing cold water refugia on hot days. Probably more important, though, is what you see on the right. Right, so that the person there is standing on the stream, right? The stream is 0 degrees Celsius, but there's a groundwater discharge from a spring in the background, and that small pool stays 1 degree Celsius, and he's about to throw those minnow traps in, and when he does, they're going to fill up with juvenile salmonids, not only living, but growing over the winter. Okay, so now let's take on the interaction with the stream-side alder patches. So again, remember, alder fix nitrogen. They got a symbiotic relationship with root bacteria that can mine nitrogen from the atmosphere and make it minerally available, not only for the alder itself, but for the broader environment. And if you look on the left, there's a map there. The dark black or dark gray polygons that are scattered about are alder patches. So you see there's a lot of them, but they're not everywhere, right? So we have some watersheds where there's very little and others where there's quite a lot. And over on the right, you see 2 results. Take the middle one first. It's interesting but unsurprising. Okay, so on the x-axis, you have % cover of alder in the watershed, ranging from 0 to about 25%. On the y-axis is dissolved inorganic nitrogen in the stream. And you see that when there's hardly any alder in the watershed, dissolved inorganic nitrogen concentrations are low, and when there's a ton of alder in the watershed, dissolved inorganic concentrations are high. Again, you know, interesting, but not super surprising. This is a major source of mining nitrogen out of the atmosphere and bringing it back into the terrestrial environment. The one on the right is both interesting and a little bit surprising. So again, the x-axis there is % cover of alder. The y-axis now is nitrogen fixation in the stream itself. So, alders have this symbiotic relationship with bacteria that allow them to fix nitrogen on the hill slope. But there are certain algae that also have symbiotic relationships with bacteria that live on the, or can live on the stream bed that can also do this, right? And so when there's not much alder in the watershed, and therefore there's not a lot of dissolved inorganic nitrogen in the watershed, the community is reorganizing itself in favoring nitrogen-fixing algae and bacteria. And the opposite is true when there's a lot of alder cover in the watershed and therefore a lot of nitrogen in the stream. So the stream is recognizing this and reorganizing itself accordingly. Well, now that groundwater is enriched in nitrogen, and we'll skip over the part about how it flows from the hill slope down to the streamside wetlands. Let's just go to the streamside wetlands themselves. And there's a lot going on here, but let me simplify it for you. There's 3 treatments, okay? Alder near is streamside wetlands that have alder directly adjacent to them on the hill slope. The alder far, there are streamside wetlands that have alder somewhere way up, maybe 100 meters or more up the hill slope, but not directly adjacent. And then no alder are streamside wetlands, and there's no alder at all on the hill slope. And I want to draw your attention to just a couple of things. The first are right here. So this is Calamagrostis canadensis above ground biomass. Calamagrostis canadensis is a grass. It's that grass you see all around me on both sides of the stream. Right? And it represents about 90% of the total above ground biomass in all of our streamside wetlands. It's ubiquitous. And look at the alder near and alder far. If there's alder anywhere on the hill slope, the Calamagrostis canadensis above ground biomass is about 400 grams per meter squared. But contrast that with the no alder site, less than 250 grams per meter squared. Right? So substantially less above ground biomass if there are no alder on the adjacent hill slope. And we know this is a nitrogen effect because if we fertilize them all with nitrogen, you have almost no effect on the alder near or alder far sites, but the no alder site explodes. And then there's no significant difference between any of the sites, okay? So these alder are mining that nitrogen out of the atmosphere, making it available to these streamside wetlands, and the streamside wetlands are responding. Now, what's this got to do with fish? So look all around me. There's all kinds of grass that's growing, that live stuff. But note in the center, and you can see it also on the left, when that stuff dies and decays in the streamside area, it falls into the stream, okay? And once in the stream, it starts to making a difference to the fish as well. You can see it again here. There's another one of these small streams. And you can see all that overhanging vegetation is the dying Calamagrostis canadensis that is falling into the stream. And just look at that topmost figure, because that's the simplest one to understand. The y-axis there is breakdown rate in degree days. Basically, if you're low on that axis, that Calamagrostis canadensis is breaking down slowly. High on this axis, it's breaking down quickly. And the x-axis, again, is now dissolved inorganic nitrogen in the stream. So this stuff's broken down by macroinvertebrates, so-called shredders and scrapers. And some of them are experts at shredding the vegetation, others experts at scraping it with these raspy tongues. And note that if there's a lot of dissolved inorganic nitrogen in the stream, they can break down this material really quickly. If there's not a lot of dissolved inorganic nitrogen in the stream, they break down slowly. Well, you can imagine this being on the right-hand side of that figure, there's rapid breakdown rate. That means you can make more bugs, bigger bugs, faster, right? And the bugs then are what the fish are eating. And we know they're eating it because of results like this, okay? So we harvest fish and everything else, and we query them from an isotopic standpoint about what they're made up of. Okay, and there's a lot going on here. I'm simplifying it down to just one site here, but I could show you dozens of these. But let me try to simplify it. In both cases, the y-axis is delta N15. In the top one, it's delta carbon 13 on the x-axis, and the bottom one, it's delta deuterium on the x-axis. Okay, and the simplest way to explain it is this. The blue circles in both plots are the in-stream producers and in-stream low-level consumers. So this is like, you know, the aquatic plants and the aquatic algae and the things that specialize in eating them, right? The green circles are the streamside wetlands. So this is streamside wetland vegetation that falls in, and the aquatic consumers, those low-level consumers that specialize in eating it. Now, when this stuff is eaten, either the stuff in the blue circle or the stuff in the green circle, there's not a big shift on the delta 13, carbon 13, or the delta deuterium axes. There's going to be 1 per mil shift for every trophic level on average, straight up that y-axis. So what we're looking for is, where do the fish plot? Do they plot above the blue circle, or in which case they're relying upon the in-stream stuff, or do they plot above the green circle, in which they're relying upon that streamside wetland stuff? And that's what we see, right? So the fish themselves are relying upon a food chain, the base of which is that streamside wetland stuff. All right. So now I can sort of bring this all together into a conceptual model that looks something like this. So this is a slope. Water is flowing from left to right, from a hill slope down to a stream at the far right. So there's groundwater flowing along. It passes beneath these alders. Recall the alders have these symbiotic relationships with bacteria in their root, where they fix nitrogen. That groundwater becomes enriched in nitrogen, moves down into that streamside area. Some bypasses go straight to the stream, right? And when it's in the stream, it supports flow, it modulates temperatures, it modulates nutrient concentrations. Some is uptaken by these streamside wetlands, where it fuels primary productivity. And some of that above ground biomass then falls into the stream, which then becomes the base of the food chain. And the beneficiaries are the fish. All right, so that's basically, I don't know, 13 years of research, cutting some corners and getting to the point. But that's all I want to talk about, the science. Now what I want to talk about is the stuff that matter. To do that, I have to step back a little bit. I was thinking about this because I gave a talk like this at AGU last year. And so this article popped up in the Chronicle of Higher Education. Can the university save the world? A new movement is underway to find out. And then in spring, another one came out that was called Max Weber Invented the Crisis of the Humanities. And both articles are substantively about the same thing. They're about this guy, Max Weber, who by all accounts, when he writes his formative essay in 1917, is a failed academic, okay? And he has but that essay has a bigger effect on our lives than I think most of us know. So Max Weber was an academic. He was in Germany, 1917. You call your history. They're in the midst of the tail end of a war, World War I. And Max Weber by this time has had sort of a nervous breakdown. He's out of academia, and he's aligned himself with some anti-war activists in Germany. And he writes this essay that we'll talk about here in a moment. And you got to remember, so 1914, World War I starts, and the Germans have the Schlieffen Plan, right? And that requires them to race to the west, defeat France within 2 or 3 weeks, and then meanwhile, right after that, race back to the east and meet the Russians, who are going to be slow to advance to their eastern front, and then they defeat the Russians and they win, okay? But as we all know, they get bogged down in the west. They don't win in 2 or 3 weeks. So they have to open up 2 fronts. One on the west with the French and eventually the Allies, and one on the east with the Russians. From that point on, this is like late 1914, they're probably going to lose the war. The only way they win is through attrition. They've got to kill more people in more horrible ways for a longer period of time so they can crush their opposition's will to persist, and they'll sue for peace. All right, so the only way you can do this is by conscripting the entire population into the effort. And the first thing they do is they come for the professors, okay? Because the professors do 2 things. Number one, they're the ones who invent, the worst ways to kill more people in a shorter amount of time. But number 2, and probably more importantly, they're the ones on the front lines of getting the students to drop out of school and jump into a trench and become cannon fodder for the Allies. Well, Max Weber's like, this is insane. This is crazy. Everything about this is wrong. And so he writes this essay, and it's called Science as a Vocation. And as I'm led to believe that the science isn't an exact translation. There's no exact word. It could also mean academics, okay? And it's exemplified, the point of this is exemplified right here. This is a quote. If a scientist feels called upon to intervene in the struggles of worldviews and party opinions, he may do so outside, in the marketplace, in the press, in meetings and associations, wherever he wishes, right? So Mark Raines, this private citizen, can go down to Dunkin' Donuts and complain about, the issues of the day, and he can go to the public meetings and stand up and shake his fist, and maybe he can even run for office, right? But Mark Raines, the scientist, has to be totally separate from that. In fact, he goes on to say, Mark Raines, the geologist, should be totally separate from anybody else. I mean, that's the only way we reach true academic enlightenment, right? We become such an expert at such a small thing that we cease to have colleagues. All right. So this hits in 1917 and it goes viral worldwide. And I got to take a step back to explain what's happening in the United States at the time. So just for an example, 1905, Pancho Villa is like a real person, and he's got banditos, and they ride on horseback from northern Mexico, and they ride into New Mexico, and they shoot up a town, and they burn it down, and they pillage, and they grab a bunch of loot, and they put it on their horses, and they ride back. So the United States is like, well, we got to do something about that. So they get General John Pershing, who ends up being the hero of America's effort in World War I. But back here in 1905, they give him 5,000 men. They go into northern Mexico, and they get lost. Their cars break down. Their little planes crash. They never make contact with the enemy, and they come back like totally defeated. Right. So when the World War I breaks out in 1914, everybody thinks we're a parochial backwater frontier town, even us. Right. So we're totally not going to get involved in the war. But we do get involved in profiteering, and we sell material to both sides, mostly to the Allies, but to both sides. And the largest transfer of wealth in Cuban history takes place. And the center of banking moves from London to New York. And we show up in 1918, kind of clean up the end of the war, sign the Treaty of Versailles, and we announce ourselves in 1919 as a world superpower. Right? I bring all this up because of this. This is a plot of the y-axis is the number of colleges and universities. The x-axis is year. And 1917 is right there, right? So this viral essay lands right at the moment that the United States is about to go from 800 colleges and universities to 4,000. And every one of those colleges and universities is built in the image of Max Weber's essay. And we all know what this looks like, right? It looks like this. It's the ivory tower. So there we are over on the right in our tower. We're at the upper floor. We're saying smart stuff. It looks like math stuff. So our colleagues in history don't even know what we're talking about. But down below, as far as the eye can see, is the community. And they're saying, why won't those scientists talk to us? Well, we won't because we're not built to. The structure of academia, including the reward structure, just doesn't encourage it. We go to professional meetings and get papers, and we write papers, and we write grants, and we talk to one another on campus, and there's no mechanism for us to really talk to the community and be rewarded for it. But can universities save the world was about this. There's a reorientation of academics towards community engagement, right? And we have, for example, an Office of Community Engagement and Partnerships. Probably almost every university does now. In fact, as we all know, USF's certainly not the vanguard of things, right? There's three major organizations, two of which have over 1,000 members that are devoted to community engagement, right? And we're members of those two. So this is sort of a large reorientation of the way academics are asked to engage the public. Now we can come back during Q&A if you want and talk about whether or not we're rewarded for it. But this is what we're being asked to do. So this is the old way, right? So normally the scientists are over there on the left. We acquire information and create knowledge, and over on the right are the end users who are creating intelligence, modifying behavior, and affecting outcomes. And there's this big chasm between the two, and the scientists just assume that our knowledge crosses that gap. But we don't really know if it does or doesn't. And I think a lot of times it doesn't. So we reimagined this and brought the end users into that production creation, right? So we're now co-producing the knowledge along with our end users. And that closes that gap. And then we have mechanisms by which after the outcomes, we have evaluation by the end users that then feeds back on us and helps us acquire new information and co-produce new knowledge that the end users can then implement towards their outcomes. All right. Well, how do you do it? You recall last year, Beth Bartel, it was a great talk if you missed it, and I'm sorry if you did. So I'm going to steal some stuff from her with attribution, and in these next two slides in particular. So she points out, we've all said this, right? If only they understood, they'd make the right decision, right? And that's the deficit model. We think they're just a deficit of knowledge. Totally wrong. There's all kinds of research to say that's not true. The important thing in communicating to the public is establishing community credibility, which is partly a function of expertise. That's what we normally think. I'm a smart person. If I tell them what they should do, they all should do it. But that's only part of it. The other part is trustworthiness, right? Which is a function of intent. So if you think that you and I share the same intents and they're good intents, you'll establish a sense of warmth to me, okay? So now we've got two variables, competence and warmth. And if you ask people to rate, other people on these axes, now warmth is the y-axis and competence is the x-axis, you can get a plot of where people are. So where are we? We'll look way out on the competence axis, and about halfway up, you'll see scientist, researcher, professor, engineer. So we don't do so bad on the competence axis. But we're a little short on the warmth axis. Look above us: doctors, nurses, teachers, childcare worker, farmer. I mean, those are our stakeholders, a lot of them, right? And so what we'd like to do is climb that warmth axis. How do we establish a sense of warmth with our stakeholders so that we can engage them in this co-production of knowledge? And we can learn something maybe from factors in successful communication of risk. And so I've replotted the data here to make a point. Look on the left towards the lower left, and you'll see the two things we were just talking about: expertise and trustworthiness. Those were the two axes on our last graph. There's a whole bunch of other things that people consider as well. We'll call that the all other. But look on the right, fully half of it is listening, caring, appearing empathetic and compassionate, right? So half of it. And here's the thing: a bunch of research suggests we've only got about 30 seconds to establish this, which makes sense. Like when we were, collecting food in the forest and dragging our knuckles back to our tribe, and we ran into another, proto-human like ourselves who was carrying a stick. We had to make a really quick decision about whether or not that person was going to let us walk by or whether they're going to club us to death and steal our food. So we're wired to make really quick decisions about whether we trust somebody, whether we like somebody, whether they're, whether we have a feeling of warmth towards them. And this made me remember Aaron Wolf, who came and talked to us last year as well. And he brought up the famous quote from the theologian David Augsburger: being heard is so close to being loved that for the average person, they're almost indistinguishable, right? So people just want to be heard. That means if I go to a public meeting and talk at people, I've probably already lost most of them, right? That's not the way to get through. Certainly not the way to get through if I just write papers and expect them to read them. So what this means is that we do hard work, and it's but it's rewarding, right? We meet our stakeholders in the time and places of their choosing and talk with them. And sometimes in the field, sometimes it's, online as we share information. A ton of time spent on this over the last 13, 14 years, whatever it's been, as we've slowly brought the entire community into the conversation. So you recall 2006, we were just doing this stuff on the left. That's that anadromous fish catalog. All we're trying to do back then is figure out where the juvenile salmonids are spending that first year of their life, particularly where they're overwintering. Groundwater, not at all part of the conversation back then. It's just something that I'm like, hey, that seems like a kind of an important thing. Look at all these seeps and springs. Now it's the central part of the conversation, and everybody gets it, right? And so here's a cross section of a real place. There's a muskeg up on that high terrace. There's South Fork of the Anchor River, a world-class fishery down at the bottom of that terrace scarp. There's recharge through those sandstones into these really thin and unproductive aquifers. I mean, I'm talking they might be a couple of feet in thickness, 4, 6, 8, maybe 10 feet in thickness. So really, really, really thin aquifers. If they can put a well in there and get 4 to 6 gallons a minute, they're feeling pretty good about themselves, right? Well, those seeps and springs at that outcrop is where the water is coming out. That's doing all those magical things for the river. But the houses are tapped into the same aquifers, and every bit of water they pull out is water that no longer comes out of those seeps and those springs. And this is now something that the stakeholders all get. And so now that feedback, they ask us, well, you know what would be nice is if we could know where this occurs, right? Could you create geospatial tools that help us understand where this is occurring and understand how to talk about and self-manage these shared resources? And so that's what we're doing now, and I'm not going to give any great detail because we're certainly nowhere near being done. But we now have a geospatial database of data and data products that covers the entirety of the 800 square mile 6 watershed project domain of the Kenai Lowlands. And we're using it in 2 main ways right now, right? And this is one of them where we're using it to predict the locations of seeps and springs. So in this case, we might go through a series of queries. You're just seeing the end of this series of queries. The base map you're looking at is topographic wetness index, which is a topographic variable that's indicative of the concentration of water. And so if you see like purple lines or dark blue thin lines, those are places that water's concentrating. That big thick line that goes from left to right is we have a 3-dimensional model of the subsurface, and we project the aquifers outward and find where we expect them to intersect with hill slopes and therefore form outcrops. So you could look at this, for example, and say, hey, I'm kind of interested in that place right there. I mean, it's a place where the aquifer outcrops, and immediately below, there's what looks like the concentration of flow. And there was a whole bunch of other things that maybe got us to here in the first place. So we would drop a point on the map, we go out in the field. In this case, we were 41 feet away from the spring box, to which we joked with the owner, we just spent 2 years and $200,000 to find a spring that you developed 20 years ago. But most of the time we're finding remote springs, places, springs that had never been found before. So that's one element, and we're still working on trying to teach a computer to do this for us, working with a bunch of people, including Joni and Stephen now, as of a couple days ago. The other thing we're working on is trying to provide visualizations that help people understand where their aquifers are most vulnerable, right? So this is a small community of Anchor Point. This is a proof of concept we did this summer with Anna Feldman, who was a Noah Holling Scholar. She's an undergraduate student in environmental engineering from Syracuse and worked with us remotely this summer. So that's Anchor Point, and the river you see along the south and then west boundary is the Anchor River, world-class fishery, right? And it wraps right around this community. And so we're doing groundwater vulnerability modeling both vulnerability in terms of contamination and overuse. And we're developing products that look something like this, right? So this is the vulnerability is expressed in colors. Yellow is most vulnerable. Sort of the lime green is also vulnerable. Green and dark blue are not so much. And then we could partition this up in terms of where are the vacant lots, and we see the vacant lots are largely the vulnerable ones over to the west, right adjacent to this really critical estuary. There's tons of springs coming off that hill slope and discharging to the stream. So providing these kinds of tools to facilitate the discussions and the decision making at the local level. And it has to be at the local level, right? And here's why. So I promised you some outcomes. I'll get to those and then we'll wrap it up. And I'll just do a few. I could give you dozens of them. But let's start with a regulatory outcome. And remember, there was that plot of warmth by competence. Okay, federal scientists, even state scientists, probably plot in the lower left-hand corner. They might be smart, but they're not from around here, so they're not competent, and they certainly don't share our intent, so we don't have a feeling of warmth to them. But the borough, which is their equivalent of a county, they do. I mean, they're smart. They're from here, so they understand the local context, and they're our neighbors. Okay, and they do things like this if they were neighbors. They create, for example, a steering group. Aggregate mining is a big deal here, right? You know, it's rapidly developing, at least in Alaska standards. And you can't make money moving aggregate very far. So it's all done locally. Where do you get aggregate? Usually out of the aquifers or the stream sides, right? So there's this big tension between the aggregate miners and people who value the fish, much of whom are people that are in the aggregate mining business themselves. So the borough convenes a steering committee. It's got regulatory authorities, it's got scientists, including people from our team, it's got landowners, it's got fisher persons, and it's got the aggregate miners themselves. And they take a hold of our information and they created their own updates to the Kenai Peninsula Borough ordinances. 3 of them in 2019 were adopted that were related to aggregate mining relative to water tables or aquatic resources, including springs, or just a catch-all one that protects against adverse effects to fish and wildlife habitats. Right? Super really weird to get a regulatory response in this landscape where few regulations exist in the first place. There's also a lot of private engagement. So this is there's a big effort on Farm Fork. It's a long way to the nearest distribution center of fresh vegetables, especially in the wintertime. And so the Natural Resource Conservation Service has a big program to support farm to fork farming. Could be that you're a farmer that sells to the stores and restaurants. Could be that you're just a local farmer trying to feed your own family. But then I was staying big effort affiliated with this. And the Cook Inlet Keeper has gotten involved. Cook Inlet Keeper is an NGO best known for opposing Pebble Mine and Chiwitna Mine and all these other big mining efforts. Big NGO. But they've gotten involved here in this program that they call Farming in Our Salmon Landscape, formally tying farming to salmon. And the main way they do it is, if you look down towards the bottom, there's 6 bullet points. And number 1, conserve water to limit water withdrawals. And their point they're making is, if you pull water out of those thin, unproductive aquifers, you're basically reducing the amount of water that's going to come out in the seeps and springs that protect our shared aquatic resources. Okay. And another one is here. So this is a series of workshops we've done with the North Pacific Fisheries Association. So this is a big organization that represents people who mine the ocean for fish. Okay, so these are people who spent all or much of their adult lives mining marine resources, especially salmon. Okay. And for most of them, they know salmon spawn in streams, but for most of them, they don't know much more than that. And they've certainly never seen one. And so we take them out on these field workshops where we catch juvenile salmonids. That's Malcolm Milne. He's sort of smiling at the camera and holding up that aquarium. And you can see there he's holding up, there's a bunch of little juvenile salmonids that we just caught in our minnow traps. And he's beaming. He's super excited. Most of these guys had never seen a juvenile salmon. Right? And all of them are stunned to find that they're coming out of these streams that are 20 centimeters wide and 4 centimeters deep, that are literally in their backyards. And so what was really interesting about this example was that when we finished this series of workshops, they decided they didn't just want to be participants in workshops, they wanted to be partners in the effort. And so they've now purchased a large headwater watershed, a super productive headwater watershed, and put it into conservation easement in perpetuity. Right? Well, is it going to continue? Right? That's the next thing. Do we have to keep doing this forever? And I don't think so. So I've probably spent 2 years of my life in the town of Homer. So I consider myself sort of an honorary member of that community. I certainly have a better social life in Homer than I do in Tampa. And I'm not even joking about that. I really do. So I'm interested in what's going on, right? So, last year, it's just before AGU. In fact, I think I was flying on this day out to AGU. I was going out a little early to visit a friend. And I got this email, the community cancels meeting, hope to see you there. Probably not, but I'm kind of interested to see what they're going to be talking about. So I open up the agenda and I see this. Between 12:10 and 12:50, groundwater presentations by the Homer Middle School 8th grade class. I have nothing to do with this. I don't even know what, I still don't have any idea what they're doing, right? So this conversation that we've started over the last few years has penetrated into the younger generation without us even being involved in it, right? Now, obviously, I got to wrap this up. I promised 40 minutes I'm there. So tons of people went into this. I can't claim ownership of this at all. most importantly, Cooey Walker from the Kachemak Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve up top, Ryan King from Baylor, kind of down towards the bottom right, Dennis Wiggum from the Smithsonian, and I have been the 4 PIs that have really kept this going, and we've gotten Kai and Sean and all kinds of students involved over the years. And this is just a fraction of them. Tons and tons and tons of partners. I think I've listed most of them here, but I've probably forgotten a ton. And then, of course, funding. A lot of funding early on from EPA and Department of Fish and Game. More recently, NOAA, the Science Collaborative Program, which if you're interested in, I'd love to tell you more about. Has been a real big supporter of our work. And I'll close here. This is all the literature I think I cited that comes out of our group, and I'll leave it here while I say thank you and I take any questions you might have. And I'm going to turn off my slides.
Yeah, you probably can see the question. There is an and Hub is in.
Oh, I see.
You can see the hands.
Yeah,
I think Yassine's got a question.
Yeah, that's me. Thanks, Mark, for this great presentation. My question is two-part. First one, I would like really to thank you for the presentation and how you addressed also the how a convergent scientific society collaboration should be done. I really like it how you made a scheme of how the feedback, you get feedback and get really the way running from the beginning, get them involved, and this is really a lesson how to make really physical, social project. And in fact, I just got an award, internal award, to address the impact of COVID-19 on the air quality and socioeconomic impacts in Florida. And so we are also involving some social scientists in the project, and we will involve also middle and high school elementary students in the project, and we hope to follow really a convergent integrated methodology as well. So that's the first part. The second part, I like it also, the scheme of how the fish will get all these nutrients, including carbon, from the soil. And I want to tell you that we just, as you know, we got a Nature communication paper just accepted, will be published by the end of this month, addressing actually a very important topic, which is the release of huge amount of mercury, not only carbon, as a result of the climate warming. And so the fish, the problem is the amount of poisonous mercury that the fish will be using along with the carbon nutrients will exceed the EPA limit if we don't adhere to the 2 degrees target of the Paris Agreement, climate agreement. And so this is really all great and relevant. Thank you.
Yeah, so I don't know much about the methyl mercury deposition up there, or mercury deposition. Presumably it's a big number, but it's pretty remote. So, but anyway, it's a really good point. I actually don't have any knowledge of that though. So,
I will send manuscript along to read about it. So yeah, so mercury fixation will happen both from the atmosphere. Well, in principle, you know, our assumption is the permafrost thaw will not result only in the release of greenhouse gases like methane and carbon dioxide, but we found, based on measurements, we measured along the Yukon River and different parts of Alaska, that there is a constant ratio of mercury to carbon. And based on this really linear relationship we found for mercury carbon, we were able to simulate.
One second. Let's try not to take it the full rest of the 20 minutes for one single question. I see that
you and I should talk about this later for sure.
Sure.
Sorry
Chuck.
about.
Okay.
Hi. Yeah, really interesting talk. So Mark, I had a question about the hazard index that you used in the coastal town. So presumably you had some like science metrics and models that gave you a continuous distribution, and then you had to choose thresholds of some sort to decide which areas were high risk and which areas were low risk. And so my question is, like, basically, how did you choose those thresholds, and did you have community input in deciding what is a high value and what is a low value, or was that a sort of expert-only decision?
Super great question, and it's a good segue. So this was arbitrary right now, not totally arbitrary. The model we use there is called Drastic. It's actually a pretty well-established water quality model. We're building a new one that is sort of better suited for our needs, but this was sort of a proof of concept. They do have thresholds selected that sort of bin it out into higher risk and lower risk. But I want to talk to your last point, which is really important. So the next, and Edgar Garon, our PhD student, works with Kai and me, is working on this, is to rebuild a new multi-metric tool that expresses risk, but to do so in that co-production of knowledge mode with the stakeholders, right? So that you know, what I just showed you will never probably be seen again in a few months, because we'll be working on a new model built with the community that speaks to their specific knowledge and needs. So yeah, absolutely. And I think that's going to be super important, because the goal in the end of this is to create sort of tools that help support discussions and decision making at the local level. And those stakeholders need to have an understanding and ownership of the information in order to properly use it, or even want to use it in the first place. So yeah, we're gonna, that was proof of concept. You know, we got the right data, we know how to do it now. But the next step is to fully engage the community in redeveloping something that works for them.
Cool, got it.
So, Mark, I have a question myself. If you try to make this kind of work, including the community, essentially in your study, it will take a long time to develop this trust, and will take a long time to start to have these people working with you. How transferable is, if you say you want to do exactly the same things in a new water set, do you need it to start 10 years ago? Or can you take the trust that you have already built in that community and transfer it somehow?
It's a good question. So the way we did it here, our on-the-ground partner is the Cat Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. So it's a NOAA facility. There's something like 27 of them nationwide. And their science director is Kui Walker, and I've known Kui since the late 90s. And I, also know Dennis and Ryan King for that amount of time too. So Kui's been in that community for a long time, and so we sort of bolted Ryan and Dennis and me and all the people we've brought to it onto the community credibility that Kui and her team had already established. I think that was really important, to have someone on the ground who actually lives there, who actually has that credibility. So as we come and go, we have a place to sort of rebolt ourselves back onto it. And I think that would probably be really important anywhere we try to apply this model, because you're right, it would take us forever to build up that credibility, and it has anyway. But we've done so through, in part, bolting ourselves onto an organization that already has that level of credibility. So I think it's transferable, but I think it would greatly help if you had some sort of an on-the-ground presence that you could bolt yourself onto.
Just a comment. We will try to figure out how to make available the full. I'm recording the presentation, so to make the full presentation available. I already got 2 or 3 email messages asking about that. There's no other questions.
Looks like David's got a hand.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Sure thing. Hey, David.
Hey, Mark, great talk. I really enjoyed it. I'm going to put on my nerdy nitrogen biogeochemist hat here for a second and ask, because that's where I have to go. Is there, it seems like the community outreach obviously is super critical. Within the sort of narrower science questions, it seems like one direction to go would be understanding the fate of that nitrogen once it's in the stream. Is there any work along those lines planned or anything like that?
Yeah, the only thing we've done to date was those isotope plots that I showed you, and indications that it's elevating from the streamside wetland allochthonous deposition upwards through the fish. But before I started there, and this goes back to Kui and her team have been working there for a long time. There was remember back in the early 2000s, there was the big marine-derived nitrogen spasm.
Yeah,
so,
ecology.
Right, it's interesting stuff. And for those of you who don't know, the fish go out into the ocean, and they, as little. I mean, they're going out, maybe less than 10 centimeters in length, and they're coming back as these big monsters, and they're importing a ton of nitrogen from the marine setting that are going up way up into the upper headwaters then, and then bears and eat them, and they crap on the hillside, and birds like peck at the dead carcasses, and then flies come, and then bats come down and eat the flies, and they go to the ridgetop and they poop, and so there's this whole transfer of nitrogen back up into the watershed. So that was originally how we got started on this. Was Kui's work in that context, and then inviting us up to start this series of projects. But we've gotten off on this groundwater thing in the last few years. That's become sort of central because I think the real problem we're seeing right now is that those aquifers are super thin and unproductive, right? And everybody's tapped into the same thing. The homeowners are pulling water out of the same aquifers that are outcropping and producing the spring and seep flow. And so we've kind of gotten sidetracked on that for the last few years, but the nitrogen stuff is certainly not dead. And it'll come back again. But at this point, all we know that once it gets into the food chain, we know it makes it into the juveniles, and what happens thereafter, we don't know.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. Thanks.
Chuck.
Yeah, sorry, that brought up a question for me because David's question brought up a question for me because in your diagram of the cross section of the aquifer, you showed the house basically doing a groundwater withdrawal and impacting the aquifer, but that house probably is a septic tank and it puts stuff back in. So, I mean, what is the budget? Is it as bad as just taking the water and that's that, or is it worse? I don't have any sense for that. So, is there a sort of budgetary model for what impact a normal Alaska household actually has on the aquifer?
That's got to be part of this vulnerability study that we do. So I could have shown you a better video that we hired an undergraduate from the University of Rochester, actually Laura Runge's son. He's an amazing animator, and he's at USF this semester since everything's online. And so we hired him to do some animations for us that better exemplify what you're talking about, right? The water is drawn up out of the aquifer, and that reduces the amount of water in the aquifer. But then it goes into a septic. Some of that goes into the atmosphere, and some infiltrates and gets back into the aquifer. And so we have an animation now that shows that and shows how it interacts with temperature, but it's all made up. Like, we don't actually know. And so that is going to has to be part of what we work on in this vulnerability, is figuring out a household scale water budget of every gallon that comes back up into the house, how much goes back down into the aquifer versus ends up either running off overland or going up into the atmosphere. So good question. And hopefully within the next 2 years, we'll have an answer.
All right.
Okay, so I think that we reached the end of our hour. Thanks to everyone that participate. We will really try to put the lecture online so that everyone can relook at it if interested. I guess if there are more questions, Mark can answer by email. I hope to see so many people also next week. And next week there will be Chuck Connor speaking I don't know about what because you still have not sent me a title. Chuck, please send me a title.
You'll get it on Thursday night.
Okay, thank you very much to everyone. It seemed that it worked better and smoother than I was expecting, so I'm very happy with that. So next week we go on with similar format.
All right.
Have everyone a good night. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.